In the quiet suburbs of Grand Junction, Colorado, Paige Birgfeld's life seemed like something out of a dream. Her three children adored her, and her reputation as a kind, hardworking single mother preceded her everywhere she went. She managed the chaos of daily life with grace, juggling the responsibilities of raising a family while running her own business. The community admired her strength and resilience. To them, Paige was the embodiment of selflessness. But beneath the polished exterior, Paige carried a weight no one else could see. Bills piled up on her kitchen counter, and her determination to provide a stable life for her children drove her to make choices she kept carefully hidden. She ran a second business, one far removed from the wholesome image she presented to the world. No one in her neighborhood suspected the secret life she led after her children went to bed. The day Paige vanished began like any other. She dropped her children off at their summer activities, her warm smile and encouraging words lingering long after she drove away. She had plans later that evening, including a business meeting she never missed. But when Paige failed to show up, her closest friend felt the first pangs of worry. Paige wasn't just dependable, she was meticulous. The missed meeting sent alarm bells ringing. Calls to Paige's cell phone went unanswered, her usual cheerful voicemail now an eerie void of silence. Hours turned into a sleepless night, her friend's concern morphing into outright fear. By the next morning, it was clear that something was terribly wrong. Paige would never leave her children without a word. The friend contacted the police, her voice trembling as she described Paige's sudden disappearance. The authorities were quick to act, knowing the importance of time in cases like these. Interviews with Paige's children painted a picture of a devoted mother who always kept them at the center of her world. "Mom never leaves us," her youngest daughter said tearfully. It was a statement both innocent and heartbreaking. Neighbors shared their own perspectives, recalling how Paige was a fixture of their tight-knit community. But one neighbor hesitated, finally admitting to seeing something unusual the night before. A car idled outside Paige's house longer than it should have, its driver cloaked in shadows. As investigators dug deeper, they began uncovering hints of a more complex story. Paige's financial struggles and the details of her second business emerged, casting her disappearance in a new light. The revelation shook those closest to her. Who could have had a motive to harm someone so beloved? The first layer of Paige's life had cracked, exposing secrets that would soon shatter the peaceful illusion her community held dear. Questions hung heavily in the air. Where was Paige Birgfeld? And who was the person behind that shadowed car? The morning sun had barely risen over Grand Junction when the first responders arrived at a scene that sent a chill through their veins. On a desolate road just outside the town's boundaries, they found Paige Birgfeld's car engulfed in ash and smoke. The charred remains of the vehicle sat eerily silent, its twisted frame a haunting reminder of the unknown events that had brought it there. Detectives stepped cautiously around the smoldering wreckage, their eyes scanning for any trace of Paige. There was no sign of her inside or anywhere nearby. What they did find, however, deepened the mystery. Among the scorched rubble, they recovered fragments of a melted necklace. It was unmistakably Paige's, a gift from her children she wore religiously. The discovery wasn't just a clue. It was a chilling sign that something far darker was at play. Investigators immediately ruled out an accidental fire. The pattern of destruction suggested intent, and the car had been deliberately set ablaze in an isolated area. It wasn't just a crime scene, it was a statement. Someone wanted whatever happened to Paige buried in flames, and the calculated effort raised more questions than it answered. Who would do this, and why? As news of the burned car spread, neighbors and friends were thrust into panic. Paige's disappearance had already shaken them, but now fear gripped the community. Conversations at local diners were hushed, filled with speculation. Had Paige been taken by someone she knew, or was this the work of a stranger who had been lurking among them? The case quickly escalated. Police cordoned off the area, searching for evidence that could reveal who was behind the fire. Tire tracks leading away from the scene provided a faint glimmer of hope, but the surrounding dirt roads made tracing them nearly impossible. Every clue seemed to dissolve into the dry Colorado air. Back at the station, detectives began piecing together Paige's last known movements. Her routine was predictable. She spent her evenings at home with her children before attending business meetings. That made the presence of her car in such a remote location all the more suspicious. Someone had taken great care to ensure it ended up there, far from prying eyes. A neighbor's statement added another layer to the growing tension. They had seen a car idling outside Paige's home the night she disappeared. The description was vague, dark-colored, nondescript, but it was a lead nonetheless. As the investigation continued, detectives couldn't ignore the sinking feeling that whoever drove that car might hold the answers to Paige's fate. The friend who had reported Paige missing was called in for further questioning. She recounted the last time she had seen Paige, her voice trembling. "She looked happy," she said, her gaze dropping. "But there was something off. I didn't think much of it at the time." The friend's words, though subtle, gnawed at the detectives' minds. What had Paige been hiding? As the day wore on, the pieces of the puzzle became increasingly fragmented. Paige's family, desperate for answers, grew more anxious with every passing hour. Her children, shielded from the details of the investigation, clung to their grandmother, asking when their mother would come home. Their innocent questions were met with silence, the weight of the uncertainty almost unbearable. For the investigators, the burned car was both a clue and a roadblock. It spoke volumes about the length someone had gone to cover their tracks, but it also left little behind to trace. Forensics teams worked tirelessly, hoping that the smallest detail might break the case wide open. A faint footprint near the driver's side caught their attention. It was incomplete, smudged by the heat and chaos of the fire, but it was there, a fragile thread connecting them to whoever had taken Paige. The question hung heavy in the air. Was Paige still alive? The burned car seemed to scream otherwise, but without a body, hope remained. It was fragile, flickering like a weak flame against the growing darkness of the case, and yet it was enough to keep the search alive, for now. As the investigation deepened, the image of Paige Birgfeld, the perfect mother and neighbor, began to shift. Hidden beneath the surface of her seemingly ordinary life was a world few knew existed. Detectives, driven by the urgency to find her, uncovered details that shocked even those closest to her. It started with a routine search through Paige's financial records. What they found was unexpected: multiple accounts tied to a business under a pseudonym. The nature of the transactions left little doubt. Paige had been operating a clandestine adult entertainment service. To her friends and family, this revelation was unimaginable. Paige, the doting mother who spent her evenings helping with homework, had a life they never suspected. Detectives faced a difficult question. Was Paige's double life connected to her disappearance? To answer that, they needed to understand why she had taken such risks. Interviews with her closest friends revealed a picture of financial strain. Despite her cheerful demeanor, Paige had been drowning in debt. Her side business wasn't a choice, it was survival. She never complained, one friend recalled, her voice trembling. She just wanted to give her kids everything. The revelation caused ripples throughout the small-town community. Friends were torn between shock and sympathy. "This doesn't change who Paige is," her best friend said firmly. "She did what she had to for her family." But not everyone was as understanding. Rumors swirled, painting Paige in an unflattering light, as if her choices somehow justified the tragedy that had befallen her. As detectives delved further into her client list, the case took another unsettling turn. One of Paige's clients had been a regular, a man with a history of violence. This individual, whose identity remained undisclosed, had been arrested several times for domestic disputes. Could he be connected to Paige's disappearance? The possibility sent shivers down the spines of investigators. But that wasn't the only avenue they pursued. Rob Dixon, Paige's second ex-husband, was becoming an increasingly suspicious figure. His calm demeanor during initial questioning gave way to inconsistencies when asked about his whereabouts on the night Paige vanished. Cell phone records placed him near her home, a fact he couldn't explain away. And then there was the financial angle. Dixon's debts were mounting, and his business ventures were failing. Paige's disappearance could very well have been the solution to his growing problems. The tension mounted as detectives pieced together the fragments of Paige's life. Her journal, discovered in her bedside drawer, painted a chilling picture. In neat, deliberate handwriting, Paige had written about her fears. She worried about Dixon's temper and described feeling as though she were being watched. One entry, dated just a week before her disappearance, was particularly haunting. "If anything happens to me, it won't be an accident." This discovery shifted the investigation into overdrive. Detectives now had reason to believe that Paige's disappearance wasn't random. She had been targeted by someone she knew or someone who had been following her from the shadows. Meanwhile, the pressure on Dixon was intensifying. His alibi, already shaky, crumbled further when a neighbor came forward. The neighbor described seeing Dixon's car parked outside Paige's house the evening she disappeared. It was strange, they said. I thought maybe he was there to drop something off, but it didn't feel right. Despite mounting evidence, Dixon maintained his innocence. His composure began to crack under the weight of the interrogations, but he refused to admit any involvement. Detectives, however, were relentless. The truth, they believed, was within reach. For Paige's family, the revelations were almost too much to bear. Her parents, who had flown in to care for her children, struggled to reconcile the Paige they knew with the person investigators described. Yet for them, one fact remained unchanged. Paige loved her children. Whatever she did, her father said, she did for them. As the shadows surrounding Paige's life grew darker, the determination to find her burned brighter. Every new discovery brought them closer to the truth, but also closer to uncovering the darkness that had engulfed her. As the investigation unfolded, Rob Dixon, Paige's second ex-husband, found himself under increasing scrutiny. At first glance, Dixon presented himself as a concerned father and cooperative witness, but as detectives peeled back the layers of his story, cracks began to show, and those cracks hinted at something much darker. Dixon's demeanor during his initial interviews was calm, almost rehearsed. He spoke about Paige with a detached tone that struck investigators as odd. I don't think she'd just up and leave, he told them, his arms crossed defensively. But Paige had her own life, you know. The vague, dismissive comment didn't sit well with anyone in the room. Cell phone records soon contradicted Dixon's account of his whereabouts on the night Paige disappeared. He had claimed he was home, tending to some overdue paperwork, but his phone pinged off a tower near Paige's house around 8:30 p.m. When confronted, Dixon's reaction was immediate and defensive. I must have driven by, he stammered. I didn't go inside. I don't even remember being over there. This wasn't the only inconsistency. A search of Dixon's financial history revealed mounting debts that he had tried and failed to hide. He was on the verge of bankruptcy, with creditors closing in. Paige had loaned him money in the past, and while she had stopped doing so after their divorce, Dixon had recently made efforts to rekindle their relationship. Friends of Paige shared stories of his persistence, with one even describing an argument they overheard. She told him no, the friend said, and he got angry, really angry. Investigators dug deeper, uncovering a troubling pattern. Dixon had a history of controlling behavior during his marriage to Paige. Friends recalled moments where he'd berated her in public, though she often brushed it off. He wasn't always like that, Paige had once confided to a friend, but when things got tough, he changed. I couldn't keep living like that. The discovery of Paige's journal only intensified suspicions. Her entries were filled with concerns about Dixon's temper. In one passage, she wrote, I try to keep things civil for the kids, but I can feel it. He's getting worse. If I push back too hard, I don't know what he'll do. Then there was the matter of the burned car. Investigators knew it had been set on fire deliberately, and while they couldn't yet place Dixon at the scene, the timing of the fire aligned eerily with his cell phone activity. A forensic examination of Dixon's vehicle added to the mounting evidence. Faint traces of Paige's DNA were found in the trunk. It wasn't enough to arrest him, but it was enough to make him the prime suspect. Throughout the questioning, Dixon's composure began to crumble. He grew agitated, snapping at detectives when pressed for details. I've already told you everything I know, he exclaimed during one session, slamming his fist on the table. You're wasting your time looking at me. But his frustration only strengthened their resolve. Dixon had motive, his financial desperation. He had opportunity, his presence near Paige's home. And he had a history that suggested he was capable of more than he let on. Neighbors added fuel to the fire. One came forward recalling a dark SUV, matching Dixon's, parked outside Paige's house the night she vanished. Another claimed they'd heard raised voices coming from the property earlier that week, though they couldn't make out what was said. Despite the growing mountain of evidence, Dixon maintained his innocence. I didn't hurt her, he insisted. I'd never do that to the mother of my kids. But his words rang hollow against the backdrop of his actions. As the days passed, investigators knew one thing for certain. Rob Dixon was hiding something, and they were determined to uncover it. The search for Paige Birgfeld had reached a fever pitch. Days had turned into weeks, and every lead seemed to yield more questions than answers. For her family and the close-knit community of Grand Junction, the uncertainty was unbearable. Hope flickered like a fragile flame, threatening to be extinguished by the growing weight of despair. The search efforts intensified as volunteers combed through fields, forests, and remote trails. Flyers with Paige's smiling face were plastered on every street corner. Her children's pleas, shared through local news stations, struck a chord with anyone who heard them. "Please help us find our mom," her youngest daughter said, her voice trembling. The community's determination swelled, but so did the gnawing fear that the worst had already happened. As detectives pressed forward, a significant breakthrough came in the form of Paige's personal journal, discovered tucked away in her bedroom. Its pages were filled with reflections, fears, and glimpses into the dual life she had been leading. Most chilling was an entry dated just weeks before her disappearance. "I don't feel safe. He's watching me again. I don't know how to make it stop." The words sent shivers through the team. Who was he? And why hadn't Paige confided in someone? The journal also hinted at strained interactions with Rob Dixon. Entries described arguments over money, moments of intimidation, and veiled threats. Paige's friends corroborated these accounts, recalling instances when Dixon's temper flared during their marriage. "She always tried to make it work for the kids," one friend said, "but you could tell she was scared of him." Detectives revisited Dixon's alibi, which had already shown signs of unraveling. The neighbor's sighting of his SUV outside Paige's house took on new significance when combined with cell tower data. His phone had pinged near her home and along the route where her burned car was found. Yet Dixon continued to deny everything. "I told you I wasn't there," he snapped during questioning. "This is a witch hunt." Meanwhile, another potential lead emerged, a strange phone call Paige had received days before her disappearance. A friend revealed that Paige had mentioned someone from her past contacting her unexpectedly. The friend couldn't recall the exact details, but the interaction had left Paige visibly shaken. "She didn't say much," the friend admitted, "just that she didn't trust him." While detectives chased down this lead, forensic teams returned to Dixon's car for a more thorough examination. Under the lining of the trunk, they discovered what could only be described as a grim clue: traces of a dark red stain, confirmed to be Paige's blood. It wasn't much, but it was enough to bolster their theory. Paige had been in that trunk. It was no longer just a possibility. Dixon was involved. As the investigation closed in on Dixon, tensions mounted within the community. Rumors swirled about who might have been involved, with some pointing fingers at Dixon, while others speculated about Paige's secret business. "People want someone to blame," one neighbor remarked, "but we need the truth, not guesses." Paige's family held on to hope, though it became increasingly difficult. Her father, visibly strained, spoke to reporters with quiet determination. "We will find her," he said, "and we will bring her home." The pressure on Dixon was reaching a boiling point. His previously cool exterior had cracked, replaced by anger and deflection. "You're wasting your time," he yelled during another round of questioning. "I had nothing to do with this." But detectives knew better. Each new piece of evidence tightened the net around him, leaving him with fewer places to hide. The case had taken a toll on everyone involved, but no one was willing to give up. Paige's journal had given them a window into her fears, a clear warning that she had seen this coming. Now, the challenge was to prove it. Every clue, every testimony brought them closer to the truth. Yet with each passing day, the haunting question remained. Would they find Paige in time, or was it already too late? The discovery of Paige's blood in the trunk of Rob Dixon's car changed everything. It wasn't a theory anymore. It was evidence. Investigators knew they were closing in, but the case wasn't over yet. They needed more. They needed answers. Detectives returned to Dixon's home with a search warrant, determined to uncover anything that could tie him directly to Paige's disappearance. The atmosphere was tense as they combed through his belongings. Dixon stood on the porch, arms crossed and jaw clenched, his frustration barely contained. "This is harassment," he muttered under his breath, though his voice carried far enough for the officers to hear. He didn't try to stop them, but his icy glare spoke volumes. Inside the house, investigators found financial records that painted a grim picture. Dixon's debts were deeper than anyone had realized. Credit cards maxed out, unpaid loans piling up, and desperate attempts to secure more money. Paige had once been his financial safety net, but when she refused to help him again, Dixon's situation became dire. Motive, it seemed, was beginning to take shape. But it wasn't just the financial records that raised eyebrows. A half-empty canister of gasoline was found in Dixon's garage, the same type used to set Paige's car on fire. The canister wasn't unusual on its own. It was the residue inside that mattered. Forensic analysis revealed a match to the accelerant used at the crime scene. It was another piece of the puzzle, fitting perfectly into the picture investigators were building. As these discoveries mounted, Dixon's behavior grew increasingly erratic. During another interrogation, he lashed out at the detectives. "You've got nothing," he snapped, slamming his fist on the table. "You're trying to pin this on me because it's easy." But his anger only fueled their determination. Every word he spoke seemed to dig him deeper into a hole he couldn't climb out of. In the meantime, Paige's friends and family continued to rally around her children, shielding them from the growing media frenzy. But even they couldn't ignore the whispers spreading through the town. People began to openly question Dixon's innocence, their faith in him eroding as the evidence stacked higher and higher. "I want to believe he didn't do it," one neighbor said hesitantly, "but it's hard to ignore what's right in front of us." The investigation took another shocking turn when detectives reviewed surveillance footage from a gas station near the location where Paige's burned car was found. The grainy footage showed Dixon purchasing a pack of matches and a small container of gasoline the day after Paige disappeared. Though the images were blurry, they were clear enough to identify him. It was damning evidence, proof that his involvement went beyond mere coincidence. Dixon, however, remained defiant. "I was filling up for yard work," he claimed when confronted with the footage. "This proves nothing." But his explanation didn't hold water, especially when combined with the traces of blood, the financial motive, and now the surveillance footage. Investigators could feel the net tightening around him, though Dixon seemed determined to fight until the bitter end. As the days turned into nights, detectives worked tirelessly, piecing together every shred of evidence. Paige's journal, her blood in the trunk, the gas canister, the surveillance footage, it all pointed in one direction. Still, questions lingered. Where was Paige's body? And could they find it in time to bring her family the closure they so desperately needed? For Paige's parents, the wait was agonizing. Her father, a stoic man who rarely showed emotion, broke down during an interview. "I just want my daughter back," he said, his voice cracking. "Dead or alive, we need to bring her home." The mounting evidence against Dixon brought the case closer to its breaking point. Detectives knew they were on the cusp of unraveling the truth, but the truth, as they would soon discover, would be darker than anyone could have imagined. The discovery came on a brisk morning when two hikers, out for what they thought would be a peaceful trek, stumbled upon something that would forever change their lives, and the investigation. Deep in a rugged, wooded area far from the main trail, they noticed a shallow depression in the earth. At first, they thought it might have been the work of an animal, but as they got closer, the truth became disturbingly clear. Partially covered with dirt and debris lay what appeared to be human remains. The smell was unmistakable, the sight horrifying. One of the hikers immediately called 911, his voice shaking as he described the scene. "I think we found a body," he stammered. "You need to send someone right now." When the call came in, investigators who had spent weeks chasing leads felt a grim sense of both relief and dread. Could this finally be the breakthrough they needed? The area was cordoned off quickly, with forensic teams arriving within hours. The dense forest provided its own challenges, the uneven terrain and thick underbrush making every step methodical and deliberate. As they uncovered the remains, it became clear they were looking at the body of a woman. The decomposition was advanced, but certain details stood out. A scrap of fabric that matched what Paige had been wearing the day she disappeared, and a single piece of jewelry still clinging to her. It was her bracelet, engraved with the names of her 3 children. The sight of it sent chills through even the most seasoned investigators. Dental records confirmed what they already suspected. It was Paige Birgfeld. Her body had been left in this remote location, her life reduced to little more than a chilling reminder of the violence she endured. But there was more. The state of her remains told a story no one wanted to hear. She had been strangled. The marks on her bones and the damage to her hyoid confirmed it. This was no accident. This was murder. Back at the station, the mood was heavy. Detectives called Paige's parents, their voices steady but somber. "We found her," they said simply. The silence that followed was deafening. Her father broke it first, his voice cracking as he whispered, Was she hurt?" The detective's answer, though carefully worded, was clear enough. Paige's parents wept together, the weight of their grief almost unbearable. The news spread quickly, shaking the already fragile community. People who had once speculated about Paige's disappearance now spoke only in hushed tones, their judgment replaced by sorrow. Candlelight vigils were held, and her children were inundated with letters and messages of support. But no amount of kind words could fill the void her absence left behind. For the investigators, the discovery of Paige's body was a turning point. They now had physical evidence that connected her death to a violent act. The search area yielded more clues, scraps of duct tape and a faint tire track nearby. Though degraded, these items could still be linked to the scene of her burned car. The pieces were starting to come together. But one question loomed large. How had her body ended up here? The remote location wasn't somewhere anyone would stumble upon accidentally. It was deliberate, chosen to ensure she would never be found. Dixon's connection to the area was tenuous, but enough to raise suspicions. He had worked a construction job nearby years earlier, and his knowledge of the terrain could have guided him to this secluded spot. Dixon's reaction to the discovery of Paige's body was telling. When detectives informed him, he paused for a moment before asking, "Does this mean you'll finally stop harassing me?" His lack of empathy was striking and incriminating. To investigators, it was another nail in the coffin of his crumbling facade. The case was far from over, but the discovery of Paige's body shifted the momentum. For her family, it was a tragic confirmation of their worst fears. For the detectives, it was a rallying cry. The truth was within their grasp, and they wouldn't rest until justice for Paige was served. As the investigation pressed forward, Rob Dixon's carefully constructed facade began to crumble under the weight of his own contradictions. Detectives, now armed with the discovery of Paige's body and mounting physical evidence, intensified their scrutiny. Every statement Dixon made was dissected, every alibi scrutinized. The web of lies he had spun was starting to entangle him. Dixon's initial claim that he had no contact with Paige the night she disappeared had already been disproven by cell phone records. The data placed him near Paige's home and along the route where her burned car was found. When confronted, Dixon shifted uncomfortably. "I must have driven by," he muttered, but the excuse felt hollow. Detectives pressed further, questioning why his phone had pinged repeatedly in the area hours after he claimed to be home. His response? Silence. The inconsistencies didn't end there. Surveillance footage from a gas station near the scene of Paige's car revealed Dixon purchasing gasoline and matches on the very day her car was burned. When presented with the footage, he attempted to explain it away. "I needed gas for my yard work," he said, his voice defensive. Yet the timing, combined with his other actions, painted a damning picture. Dixon's behavior during questioning grew increasingly erratic. Once composed and cooperative, he now lashed out at investigators, accusing them of targeting him unfairly. "You've already decided I'm guilty," he yelled during one interrogation. "You're not even looking at anyone else." But his outburst did little to sway the detectives, who were steadily piecing together the puzzle. New witnesses also began to emerge, adding to the mounting evidence. A former co-worker of Dixon's came forward with a chilling recollection. "He used to joke about how easy it would be to make someone disappear," the co-worker said. "At the time, I thought it was just talk, but now, I'm not so sure." This testimony, while not definitive, added a sinister layer to Dixon's character. The forensic evidence was the most damning. Investigators had already found traces of Paige's blood in the trunk of Dixon's car. Now DNA analysis confirmed that hair fibers found near her body matched Dixon's. It was a critical link, a connection that tied him directly to the crime scene. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Dixon maintained his innocence. He hired a high-profile defense attorney who wasted no time attacking the integrity of the investigation. "This case is built on circumstantial evidence," the attorney argued during a press conference. "There is no proof my client committed this crime." But the public wasn't convinced. The tide of opinion had turned sharply against Dixon, and his once supportive community now viewed him with suspicion. As the walls closed in, Dixon attempted a desperate move. During a subsequent interrogation, he implicated a mysterious third party, a man he claimed had a vendetta against Paige. "It wasn't me," Dixon insisted. "I think someone else wanted her gone." The story, however, was flimsy at best. Detectives couldn't find any evidence to support his claim, and Dixon's inability to provide details further eroded his credibility. The investigation reached a boiling point when forensic teams linked the duct tape found near Paige's body to a roll discovered in Dixon's garage. The tape's adhesive matched precisely, leaving no room for doubt. This final piece of evidence was the tipping point, solidifying Dixon's status as the prime suspect. For Paige's family, the developments were bittersweet. They had long suspected Dixon's involvement, but hearing the details of his actions was a fresh wound. Her father, in a rare moment of vulnerability, expressed his frustration. "He's trying to lie his way out of this," he said, "but the truth will catch up to him." And it was catching up fast. Dixon's web of lies was unraveling, strand by strand, leaving him with nowhere to hide. Justice for Paige Birgfeld was closer than ever, but the road ahead remained fraught with challenges. The detectives knew that securing a conviction would require meticulous preparation, and they weren't about to let Dixon slip through their fingers. The call came unexpectedly. A former acquaintance of Rob Dixon was ready to talk. Investigators, accustomed to leads that fizzled out, were initially skeptical, but as the witness recounted their story, the room fell silent. This wasn't just idle gossip or baseless speculation. This was the kind of breakthrough they had been waiting for. The man, who asked to remain anonymous, described working alongside Dixon years earlier on a construction project. "We weren't close," he began cautiously, his voice steady, "but I remember him making comments that stuck with me." According to the witness, Dixon often joked about how easy it would be to make someone disappear. At the time, the remarks were dismissed as dark humor, but in light of Paige's disappearance, they took on a far more sinister meaning. "He talked about knowing places where no one would ever find you," the man continued, his expression grim. "Back then, it seemed like he was just trying to sound tough, but now, it feels like something else." The witness's account added another chilling layer to Dixon's growing profile. A man who had not only thought about violence, but had seemingly planned for it. Detectives knew they couldn't rely solely on the witness's word. They needed corroboration, and they found it in Dixon's own actions. A review of his previous work history revealed that the remote area where Paige's body was discovered was one of his old job sites. He had spent months working there, gaining intimate knowledge of the terrain. This wasn't a random dumping ground. It was a calculated choice by someone who knew exactly how to hide a body. As the investigation gained momentum, another piece of the puzzle fell into place. A neighbor of Dixon came forward with a startling observation. On the night Paige disappeared, they had seen Dixon loading something into the trunk of his SUV. "It was late," the neighbor said, their voice wavering. "I didn't think much of it at the time, but now I can't stop wondering what it was." This revelation sent a ripple through the community. People who had once defended Dixon began to reconsider their stance. "I thought I knew him," one neighbor admitted, "but maybe we didn't know him at all." The growing suspicion wasn't just confined to the public. Within the walls of the police department, there was a renewed sense of urgency. Dixon's lies were unraveling, and the truth was clawing its way to the surface. The witness's testimony also provided critical insight into Dixon's behavior. According to the man, Dixon had a volatile temper and a need for control. "He didn't like being told no," the witness explained. "If things didn't go his way, he'd lose it. I can see how that could lead to something terrible." This description aligned with the accounts from Paige's journal and her friends, painting a consistent picture of a man whose anger could boil over into violence. Dixon, however, remained defiant. When detectives confronted him with the new evidence, he doubled down on his denials. "This is a witch hunt," he spat, his fists clenched. "You're trying to frame me because it's convenient." But his protests carried little weight. The evidence was stacking up, and his credibility was crumbling. For Paige's family, the witness's testimony was both a relief and a torment. It brought them closer to understanding what had happened to her, but also confirmed their worst fears. Her father, stoic as ever, expressed his gratitude to the investigators. "You're getting closer," he said quietly. "Just don't let him get away with this." The new developments also reignited the community's support for Paige's family. Vigils were held, and donations poured in to help care for her children. The town, once divided by rumors and speculation, now rallied together in pursuit of justice. As the chapter of Dixon's lies neared its conclusion, one thing was clear: the walls were closing in. He had spent years constructing a facade of innocence, but the cracks were now too wide to ignore. The truth, no matter how deeply he buried it, was finally catching up to him. The courtroom buzzed with tension as the trial of Rob Dixon began. It was a spectacle unlike anything the small community of Grand Junction had ever seen. Reporters packed the gallery, their cameras poised to capture every moment. Paige Birgfeld's family sat in the front row, their faces solemn but resolute. determined to see justice served. The weight of the case was palpable, every detail of Paige's tragic death poised to unravel before the jury. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. With deliberate precision, they painted Dixon as a man driven by desperation and rage, a man who would stop at nothing to silence Paige. They began with the financial motive, presenting evidence of Dixon's spiraling debt and failed business ventures. Rob Dixon wasn't just broke, the prosecutor stated firmly. He was drowning, and Paige was his last lifeline, a lifeline she refused to throw him. The jury listened intently as the prosecutor walked them through Dixon's movements on the night of Paige's disappearance. Cell phone records placed him near her home and the remote site where her burned car was found. Surveillance footage from the gas station showed him purchasing gasoline and matches, directly linking him to the fire. These aren't coincidences, the prosecutor declared. They're a roadmap to murder. Forensic evidence became the cornerstone of the trial. DNA analysis confirmed that Paige's blood was found in the trunk of Dixon's car, along with strands of her hair. Duct tape found near her body was matched to a roll in Dixon's garage, and the tire tracks near her shallow grave were consistent with his vehicle. Each piece of evidence wove a damning narrative, a narrative the defense struggled to dismantle. Dixon's defense team fought back with vigor, attempting to discredit the investigation. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial and suggested that Paige's secret business might have made her vulnerable to other potential threats. Rob Dixon is an easy target, the defense attorney argued, but the truth is far more complicated. They called witnesses to question the integrity of the forensic process, sowing doubt in the minds of the jury. The emotional core of the trial came with the testimonies. Paige's family members took the stand, recounting the anguish of losing her and the toll it had taken on her children. "They ask about her every day," Paige's father said, his voice breaking, "and I have to tell them that she's not coming back." His words hung heavily in the air, the raw pain piercing the courtroom. The prosecution countered the defense's claims with devastating clarity. They called a former co-worker of Dixon's who testified about his dark jokes and volatile temper. The co-worker's chilling recollection of Dixon boasting about knowing places where no one would find you struck a nerve. It was a stark reminder of the calculated nature of the crime. The final blow came when the prosecution replayed Dixon's interrogation footage. His changing stories, defensive outbursts, and lack of empathy painted a picture of a man cornered by his own lies. The courtroom watched in silence as the video played, Dixon's own words betraying him. "I didn't hurt her," he stammered in one clip, his voice cracking. But his guilt was written in his tone, his body language, a guilt impossible to ignore. As closing arguments began, the prosecutor left the jury with a poignant reminder. Paige Birgfeld was a mother, a daughter, a friend. She deserved better than the fear and violence she faced. Rob Dixon took her life, and he tried to bury the truth. But the truth has a way of finding its way to the surface. The defense attorney, in a final bid to sway the jury, urged them to consider the lack of a direct witness to the crime. "There are gaps in this case," he said firmly, "and in those gaps, there is doubt." But as the jury deliberated, the evidence seemed overwhelming. Rob Dixon's web of lies had been untangled, leaving him exposed. The verdict loomed like a storm on the horizon, ready to deliver justice or shatter the fragile hope that Paige's family clung to. The tension in the courtroom was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every eye was fixed on the jury box as the foreperson rose to deliver the verdict. The air seemed to hold its breath, the collective anticipation of Paige Birgfeld's family, friends, and the community wrapped tightly around those fateful words. "We, the jury, find the defendant Robert Dixon guilty of first-degree murder." The words hit the room like a thunderclap. Paige's father gripped the edge of the bench, his shoulders trembling as years of anguish spilled over. Her mother clutched his hand, her silent tears streaming down her face. In that moment, the weight of justice felt both crushing and liberating. The man who had stolen Paige's life would finally pay for what he had done. Rob Dixon sat motionless at the defendant's table, his face pale but impassive. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, but Dixon didn't respond. Perhaps he had known all along that this was the inevitable outcome, or perhaps the reality of his fate had only just begun to sink in. Whatever the case, the verdict was clear, and there was no escaping it. For the prosecution, it was a hard-won victory. Months of painstaking investigation and relentless pursuit of the truth had led to this moment. The lead prosecutor spoke briefly to reporters outside the courthouse, their tone a mixture of relief and determination. Today, justice was served for Paige Birgfeld and her family. This verdict sends a powerful message. No one is above the law. Inside the courtroom, the sentencing phase began. Dixon's defense team made a final attempt to appeal for leniency, citing his lack of a prior criminal record. But the prosecution countered with the brutality of his crime. Robert Dixon did not simply take a life, the prosecutor said, their voice unwavering. He betrayed the trust of his own family. He burned every bridge of decency in his desperate attempt to evade responsibility. He deserves the maximum punishment. The judge, somber yet firm, handed down the sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. The words echoed through the chamber, a decisive end to Dixon's freedom and a grim reminder of the irrevocable damage he had caused. Paige's parents exchanged a glance. Their grief mingled with a sense of vindication. It wasn't closure. They would never truly heal from losing Paige, but it was justice. Outside the courthouse, the community gathered for a vigil in Paige's memory. Candles flickered in the evening breeze as friends and neighbors shared stories of her kindness and resilience. Her children, shielded from the media storm, clung to their grandparents, their innocence a poignant contrast to the sorrow around them. The love for Paige was palpable, a reminder that even in the face of tragedy, her legacy endured. As the crowd dispersed, Paige's father spoke softly to a reporter. "This verdict doesn't bring my daughter back," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But it means she mattered. It means the truth mattered, and that's something." The trial's conclusion brought a semblance of peace to Grand Junction, but the scars of the case remained. For the detectives who had worked tirelessly to piece together the evidence, it was a bittersweet victory. They had found justice for Paige, but the memory of her tragic end would linger in their minds. In the end, the verdict marked a turning point, not just for Paige's family, but for a community forever changed by her story. It was a testament to the power of perseverance, the importance of seeking truth, and the unbreakable bonds of love. Paige Birgfeld's life had been stolen, but her voice had not been silenced. Through the relentless pursuit of justice, her story had been heard. The trial was over, and justice had been served. But for Paige Birgfeld's family, friends, and the community of Grand Junction, the aftermath of her tragic death lingered like an open wound. The courtroom's final gavel had fallen, but the echoes of her story would resonate far beyond its walls. Paige's children returned to their grandparents' care, their innocence shielded as much as possible from the painful details of the case. Yet, the absence of their mother was a void that no amount of love could entirely fill. Her eldest daughter, now stepping into a protective role for her siblings, often found herself staring at old photographs, her mother's radiant smile offering both comfort and sorrow. "She wanted us to be happy," she said softly to her grandmother one evening. "I'll make sure we are." In the months following the trial, Paige's parents turned their grief into action. They established a foundation in her memory, focusing on providing support for single mothers in financial difficulty, a cause Paige would have fiercely championed. The foundation became a beacon of hope, a way to ensure that her legacy would continue to impact lives positively, even in her absence. The community, too, rallied around the Birgfeld family. Friends organized fundraisers, neighbors cooked meals, and strangers left heartfelt messages on the family's porch. Grand Junction, once shaken by rumors and fear, now stood united in compassion and solidarity. Paige's story had become a cautionary tale, but also a reminder of the resilience that could emerge from tragedy. For the detectives who had worked tirelessly on the case, the resolution brought a bittersweet sense of closure. The image of Paige's journal, her haunting words of fear and foresight, remained etched in their memories. "She knew something was coming," one detective admitted during an interview. "We couldn't save her, but we owed her the truth." Rob Dixon, now serving a life sentence without parole, faded from the public's attention. His name, once uttered with suspicion and anger, became a footnote in the larger narrative of Paige's life and the community's recovery. For her family, it was never about him. It was about honoring Paige and ensuring her story was remembered, not for the way her life ended, but for the way she lived it. As time passed, healing began to take root. Paige's children found moments of joy in small things, a family game night, a walk in the park, gradually reclaiming pieces of their childhood. Her parents, though still grieving, found solace in the work of the foundation, knowing they were carrying on Paige's mission to create a better world for her children and others like them. On the first anniversary of her disappearance, the family gathered with friends and supporters at a park where Paige often took her children. Candles were lit, their flickering flames a symbol of her enduring presence. Her father spoke briefly, his voice steady but thick with emotion. Paige was more than what happened to her, he said. She was a mother, a daughter, a friend, and she will always be loved. The vigil ended with a moment of silence, the crowd gazing at the stars that Paige had once pointed out to her children. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of nights, light could be found. For those who knew her, Paige Birgfeld would never be forgotten. Her story, though marked by tragedy, became a testament to the strength of love, the pursuit of justice, and the power of a community united by compassion. And as her children grew, carrying her lessons and her love in their hearts, Paige's legacy shone brighter than ever. What do you think of Rob Dixon and his actions in this case? From which region are you watching this video? Share your thoughts in the comments below and rate this story from 0 to 10. How shocking and impactful did you find it? Let us know.